First of all, perhaps it's worth giving you a little bit of background about how I've been involved in this area to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. I started off in my interest in stroke working on a register in 1985, set up by Charles Warlow and colleagues in Oxfordshire, the Oxfordshire Community Stroke Project or Register. And that was a community-based stroke register with follow-up, primarily looking at incidence. I moved to Edinburgh in 1990 and there set up the so-called Lothian Stroke Register, and that was succeeded by the Edinburgh Stroke Study. And both of those are hospital-based registers, again with follow-up. I was involved in developing the Royal College of Physicians Stroke Audit package, which was my first foray into audit, large-scale audit, and how to measure the performance of stroke services. And since 2002, I've been leading on the Scottish Stroke Care Audit, which is a national audit of performance of stroke care in Scotland. Been involved with others, Charles Wolfe and others, looking at international collaborative studies of stroke audits and stroke registers. And today I spend most of my time involved in running multi-centre randomised controlled trials. We're going to be talking about registers, and if you look in the dictionary, registers, registries, almost interusable terms. I suppose they're not well defined, but it's basically collecting data systematically on consecutive cases. And it will overlap considerably with what you've maybe heard about in the first section before the break, case control studies, cohort studies. But often registries are started with no very well-defined purpose. And I think one warning for those of you who might consider setting up a registry is that without any purpose, you may end up expending an enormous amount of effort and therefore resource to no great effect. So it is probably worthwhile thinking about one's purpose or purposes before one sets anything up. Possible uses of registries, and again these overlap with what you've already heard, might be to determine the incidence of stroke, or indeed any of its subtypes, the frequency of risk factors amongst the patients that you see, the prognosis of stroke or subtypes of stroke with respect to a variety of outcomes. And if one does collect those data relating to the prognosis, the outcomes of the patients you see, then you do have the possibility of looking at those factors which are associated with outcome, so-called prognostic factors, and you could go into the area of stroke research, which is trying to identify tools to allow us to better predict what is going to happen to our patients in the future, because that may be helpful to clinicians, to researchers in their everyday practice. A lot of registers are set up to look at the use of health services for stroke patients and the use of specific interventions. And I'll come back to some of those. And you can use registers to look at the burden of stroke, which is, if you like, a summation of the incidence and the outcome, that is the cost, the outcomes in terms of disability, etc. But also you could look at the cost of caring for patients, both the hospital costs, community costs, and health versus social care costs. So registries have an amazing variety of possible purposes, which ideally are defined before you set it up. So an example of a register I was involved with, the Oxfordshire Community Stroke Project, which ran from 1981 to 1988. This measured the incidence of stroke in the population of Oxfordshire, in a population of about 105,000 people. And at the time, I think that was considered quite interesting data. It was one of the first incidence studies, certainly in the UK and in Europe at the time, just to define how common stroke is at different age groups. Peter Rothwell came along 20 years later and repeated the study, and he called his the OXVASC study, and that really used a very similar methodology in the same population, and he demonstrated that the incidence had changed from 2000, so incidence changed from here to here over the 20 years, demonstrating a reduction in age-specific incidence over a 20-year period. Now, that was considered interesting because we had incidence change over time, which is a fairly rare thing. Had he just come along and done it in another population, it probably would have struggled to be published. Certainly not, it wouldn't have been published in something as prestigious as the Lancet. So determine incidence, if one wants a register to define the incidence, that's the number of new cases in a population over a defined period of time, usually a year. You need a very well-defined large population. Large, so you get precise measures of incidence. Defined, and you may define it geographically, but you then have to work out how you're going to deal with patients, people who are coming into the population and people who are leaving the population during the study. In Oxfordshire studies, we defined it on the basis of general practitioner lists. You need multiple overlapping methods of case ascertainment so you don't miss cases. You want to give you some confidence in the results. You need to look very hard and trying to detect all cases in the population. You can't just rely on hospital admissions. You need to look at the community, and you need to try and find cases all manner of different ways. Death certificates, maybe the radiology reports, taking referrals from general practitioners and other things. You have to look in the private sector if there's a large private sector in your health service. So you need to identify both hospital-admitted and community cases. You may believe as a hospital doctor that all cases of stroke come to hospital. We sort of believed that in Oxfordshire and found that only 55% of stroke patients were admitted in Oxfordshire. Lots of the minor strokes were not getting into hospital. They were being managed by their general practitioners in the population. And of course you need to make sure that if you're interested in stroke or a specific subtype, you need to have accurate diagnosis. So you need to somehow standardize that, use standard definitions, and nowadays have a high level of imaging available, CT, MRI, and other imaging to better define your cases. Is incidence interesting? Well, as I said, it depends. Changes over time, differences between places may be interesting, may be worth doing, and they may be publishable in high-impact journals. But the methods, if you're going to look at changes over time and differences between places, need to be standardized, and there are standardized methods described in the literature. It's not going to be novel unless your population you plan to measure incidence in is very different from others. So us doing another incidence study in another part of the United Kingdom is unlikely to be of interest to the wider research population. But if you are working in a population such as Africa, where incidence really has not been measured accurately, then that will be of great scientific interest. And it may, looking at differences between incidence in Africa, in other parts of the world, may give us clues as to the importance of different risk factors and causes. To identify new risk factors, one needs controls. And as you've already heard, looking at case control studies, they're a different sort of study design, and it involves a lot of work to identify a proper control group. But you may use your register as one way of identifying the cases. This is looking at an international comparison of the different sorts of stroke, ischemic, hemorrhagic, subarachnoid and undetermined, in different populations. And you might at least come up with some hypotheses about why those proportions may vary. And of course we do know, for instance, that Asian populations, China for instance, seem to have a higher risk of hemorrhage as a proportion of all stroke than in maybe a European population, and that raises interesting issues about the underlying pathologies and the causes. So a register with follow-up becomes a cohort, and we've already heard in the first section quite a lot about cohort studies, and I have to say very rigorous cohort studies, far more rigorous than many which are carried out. These can provide an overall prognosis with respect to outcomes and, as I said, therefore an idea of the burden of stroke in the population. It can allow you to look at prognostic factors that are baseline factors which you can measure shortly after the stroke, which are associated with specific outcomes. What factors such as stroke severity are associated with increased risk of dying or being disabled, for instance. But to be able to do this, you need to collect lots of baseline data and measure the right factors. And many people don't do that in a simple registry, where they decide later to then look at prognostic factors. And you can take a cohort based on a registry and compare it with other cohorts. But of course you are going to struggle to make comparisons. Is the prognosis in this cohort different from this one in a meaningful way, or was it just that we collected different sorts of patients? And I'll come back to that point a little later. So to determine prognosis in your registry, in your cohort, you do need to ensure that you have complete follow-up. And too many registries do have some follow-up, but they lose too many of their patients, more than say 5 or 10%, and that gives you very little confidence in the reliability of their findings. I read many papers when I'm reviewing articles which are based on registers, and they provide the outcome of their patients at hospital discharge, which of course may be 2 days after the stroke, a month or 6 months after the stroke. That isn't very helpful. The longer you will follow up the patients for, the longer the length of stay, the more likely the patient is to, for instance, die or have another stroke. And so you really need, if you're looking at prognosis, to define the time point at which you're going to measure outcome, be it 3 months, 6 months, a year, or longer, or if you want to do it and you've got lots of energy, multiple time points. You can choose what your measurement of outcome is. Everybody tends to measure survival or death. Lots of people measure disability using some standardized score such as the modified Rankin, Artel index. Lots of people measure recurrent stroke, although it's difficult to define often and difficult to measure reliably. Those are probably not going to give you anything that's very publishable because it's all been done before. It's got to be something a bit novel to your study. Fewer studies have looked at the risks of quality of looked at quality of life, mood, pneumonia, seizures, etc. And it may be that based on your registry, if you follow patients up for an outcome of interest, which hasn't been widely studied before, that may lead to a publication. Here's some data from the Oxfordshire Community Stroke Project, very old now, historical data if you like, looking at the outcomes of different sorts of patients with intracellular hemorrhage and subarachnoid ischemic stroke, looking at their outcomes in terms of death, dependency, independence over the first year. Relatively rare data still to be community-based, complete follow-up for a year. But, not very novel nowadays. Here's some other data looking at the contributors of hospital costs in a cohort of patients. And this may surprise some people that when you look in detail, when you dig down on what are components of the cost of caring for people in hospital, the vast majority of those costs, certainly in the UK health service, are those associated with nursing. They're the largest group of people who need to be paid. And in fact, how much doctoring you give the people, how many drugs you give them, how much tests you do, makes up a rather small proportion of the total cost in the UK situation. Now that may be very different in, say, the US, where length of stay may be very short in the acute hospital, and therefore investigations, drugs and doctoring are a very large component of that. But in the UK, where length of stay is perhaps a month on average, a lot of the care is rehabilitation and ongoing care of disabled people, then this becomes the major factor. One of the most widely recognised, widely used registries is the SITS registry, which was set up originally to look at the safe implementation of specifically alteplase in ischemic stroke. And primarily this was looking at the alteplase treated patients in a very large number of places in a large number of countries. More recently it's been extended to things like SITS Open, which is trying to look at the outcomes of patients treated with thrombectomy in some places, and with similar patients but not treated with thrombectomy from other places where they can't do thrombectomy, with the idea that it might tell you about the effectiveness of thrombectomy in acute ischemic stroke. But of course, and this is often overlooked, this is not a randomised controlled trial. These patients treated with thrombectomy are likely to be fundamentally different from those who are not given thrombectomy in different places. They're managed in different centres and they may have very different characteristics. You may try and match for those characteristics, but it still doesn't give you matched groups on those unmeasured characteristics which are difficult to adjust for. None of these registries necessarily take all unselected cases. They all tend to be biased, in at least some centres, by selection bias. Maybe for the patients who do well, or maybe those who are more easily detected. And that can give you a very biased view of the performance. And it doesn't give you an idea over an entire regional country because many centres won't participate in these. So you cannot guarantee that the data coming from registries with respect to treatments, that they're unbiased, so it gives you maybe a biased view, a potentially biased view of the use of interventions, the complication rates and other outcomes. Registries and audits do not identify new risk factors. We need case control studies, cohort studies to define those. They don't provide reliable information on the effectiveness of treatment. We need randomised controlled trials. Identifying all cases requires a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of energy, and often a lot of money. If you are saying your register is a research study, then you will need ethics approval, and they will almost certainly say you need to get explicit consent from the people you're entering. And then you have to deal with the problem that some of the patients will say no thank you. And therefore your register will only include those who are consenting, and it may well be biased in some way and not representative of all cases. That's a major problem. If you call it audit and not research, certainly in the United Kingdom, you will not need to get explicit consent and you avoid that potential bias. Routine follow-up requires even more resource and energy. So the scope of one's registry depends on its purpose, and you need to define that before you set it up. You need to just know whether your register is going to be a voluntary register or whether you're going to mandate entry into it. And that will affect how generalisable it is and how unbiased it is. Is it going to be local, regional or national? Is it going to be community-based and hospital-based, or one or both? What are your inclusion criteria? Is it looking at all stroke? Is it looking at one particular type of stroke? Or is it intervention-based, looking at one particular group of patients treated in a particular way? Some of you may be aware of the WHO tool which has been developed, which is the stepwise approach to stroke surveillance. This just provides an off-the-shelf tool that if you want to somehow measure the burden of stroke in your population. This offers a tool for you to do it in a standardised way, which then allows you to compare your data to those from elsewhere. So this provides you with definitions, data collection forms, and some IT to go with it. So a very simple, standardised method of collecting, analysing, and disseminating data. The step design refers to these different levels which you're going to try and collect data. So step one is just collecting information on stroke patients admitted to health facilities. As I've said, that may miss a large number of patients occurring in a population. The next is to identify community-based fatal cases, maybe using death certification. And then the third step, to try and get a broader, a more inclusive register, is to include community-based non-fatal stroke cases. That's step 3. Again, there's the issue of whether you're going to get explicit consent, which means you're going to then select, or implicit consent. And STEPS only builds into it at the moment an optional 28-day follow-up, so it doesn't provide much information on longer-term outcomes. I'm going to move on now to talk about audits and looking at how these overlap with registries. In these you need to measure performance against some standard, you identify a gap, and then you aim to close the audit loop by implementing an improvement to improve performance. You do collect data on consecutive patients, so it's a registry, and you can just do a sample of cases collected for a short period of time, randomly sample the cases, and beware of this, many just take a convenient sample, which can be very biased. The cases you could find easily may well do better than the ones that don't. These may be local or regional or national, and usually local audits are of local interest, national audits are going to be of more generalised interest and more publishable. You need to look at the structure of the audits, about how you're going to look at the resources, are you going to look at the structure, the processes and the outcomes of patients. In general audits, we'll look at the process, and I'll come back to that. This is an example of what happens when you look at outcomes. This is the 2 hospitals in our city being compared in terms of their death rate, which I'll come back to. We've done the Scottish Stroke Care Audit, which includes all 32 hospitals in Scotland, and each of the hospitals collects data each year on the organisation of their services, but we look mostly at the process of care. It's an unbiased and mandated audit, so you're not allowed to select cases or hospitals. And for each hospital, they have an auditor who is semi-independent of those delivering the care. They provide centralised data, monthly reports of performance, and then we publish data identifiable by hospital, so it's open. So one standard is that 90% of stroke patients should be admitted to a stroke unit on the day of admission or the day after. And we provide graphs like that. These are all the hospitals in Scotland, looking to see whether performance is changing over time, how many have reached the standard of 90% within the first day, and where there's significant worsening over time. Obviously, if you're going to do this, you need to reliably measure the performance. What is a stroke unit? It isn't just a sign on a door. You need to measure the delay. You can't do it in hours because we can't define exactly what hour they were admitted to the stroke unit often. And ideally, if you're going to go to all this effort, you need to be focusing on evidence-based standards such as stroke unit care rather than something which we don't think makes any difference to the patients. Of course, the standard won't apply to all patients. Some will go off the neurosurgical unit because they've had a hemicraniectomy. They won't meet that standard. Another standard is with collecting swallow screen. 90% having a swallow screen within the first day or 2. You can see there's wide variation in performance. Imaging, 90% should have a CT or MRI within 24 hours, unless there's a documented contraindication. Again, wide-ranging performance with improvement over time. Aspirin within the first day or two of admission. Again, evidence-based, based on systematic reviews, looking at wide variation in performance, but again, generally improving over time. Thrombolysis, many people are measuring this in SITs as a register. We do it in the audit. We've got a standard of 80% receiving the bolus within 1 hour of arrival. This is not selected, this is all cases in Scotland. And you can see that there's variation in performance across the hospitals. So those are processes of care, that's what we focus on. You can try and use routine data such as mortality data to look at survival, both at hospital and over a 6-month period, say, and hospital discharge destination. But you have to be careful in interpreting these outcomes because you need a good measure of case mix. So observing variation in outcomes does not tell you what needs to be improved. So just because your hospital has better outcomes than the hospital next to you does not tell you why that is. Outcomes are very popular with politicians and healthcare managers because they think that's relevant. And it is, of course, relevant, but it's not very helpful in quality improvement. You need to adjust for least severity, and this is a simple severity, the 6 simple variable model we use in the Scottish audit, where we ask these questions at baseline, but you could be using age, pre-stroke dependency, and the NI stroke scale if you chose, and you can see that these are the unadjusted case fatalities at 6 months in 5 hospitals in Scotland, with huge differences, 2-fold differences in mortality. But if you adjust for case mix, they all come together. There's hardly any difference. We know that's likely to be true because none of our treatments are very effective. So most of this is going to be due to differences in severity of stroke and types of patients admitted. If you want to use your audits to improve quality of care, yes, you measure performance against standards, you identify the gap and the variations between centres, you learn from the centres who seem to be doing things well, you feed back the information to staff, and you have to have some way of implementing change. Simply measuring performance won't improve the process or the outcomes of care. And when you're doing this, beware that people will want to manipulate the data to look as if their performance is better than it is, to make sure it looks as if it's improving when it possibly isn't. They'll exclude the patients who are not treated according to guideline. They'll exclude the patients who seem to have done badly. And our managers are particularly keen to do that, so they look good. You need large numbers to be confident that any differences are not due to chance alone. And that's why we do national audits, and we look at periods of at least a year or more between large hospitals. So in summary, before setting up a register or audit, carefully define your purpose. Recognise the limitations of these methodologies. Having defined your purpose, produce a methodologically rigorous protocol. Identify the resources you need and therefore maybe the funding. Carry out the project. Report the results. Don't expect to get it published in a high-impact journal unless you're doing something really novel. A lot of this is for local interest and maybe relatively low-impact journals. But we'll hear more about that, I think, in the final presentation this afternoon.